What was that?
What?
Felt like we hit something.
For real?
Yo, man, I think we should check it out. Yo. Courage the cowardly dog.
Maybe he got rabies.
Nah, that's just how he gets.
You look kinda scared.
He's a cowardly dog.
Does he have a collar?
It's a group.
Shouldn't have stopped, man.
We interrupt this program to bring you...
I'm here with Erika, and they are an organizer who does a lot of their work on high schools as far as LGBTQIA+, and they, I think what their work does is really important because it's very important to have access to queer information and queer spaces, especially at a younger age, so it's not something you have to worry about later, but they could tell you more about it. So, yeah, Erika, if you want to talk or introduce yourself and talk more about kind of your experience.
All right. Yeah, thanks for that. I've been doing youth organizing for a really long time. So I started as a teenager, like as one of the youth myself, when I was in high school. And now as an adult, like I really like recognize the value of youth organizing as like a tool to empower young people into a deeper analysis than they would like receive otherwise, or like be given the space to process through. And so I end up in a lot of spaces where youth organizing in general is happening, but like LGBTQ specific organizing is really important to me. One, because I think it's necessary for like young queer people to feel like they have the space to explore their authenticity in a way that's safe for them. But also like because I think that it's one of those ways where it's like you're challenging a social construct where that is attached to like real people's experiences, like their personal identity. So it forces people out of this like frame that they've been put like socialized into, because it's like, right, like if you're not respecting the like personal identities of folks, like what are you doing? Like what is your social justice activism actually about? And like in like making it so that folks realize that like gender and sexuality in themselves are like constructs, like it helps them like bridge this analysis of like, actually, you know what, a lot of things are social constructs, and that includes like so many other like things like capitalism, right?
Right.
That it, and so anyways, yeah, I would say those are the main reasons why I'm doing this work. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really important, and just understanding that relationship that capitalism does play in maintaining heteronormativity and cisnormativity, and like without this education, you just have a lot of people just kind of being really insecure straight persons because
Yes.
they don't know that there are other options to be other than straight, and that's awful. No one should have to live in a cage like that. And just as a whole, because you organize in high schools, what would you say is the most consistent thing you see as kind of a trend for people who don't just come into these spaces looking for like help and information, but also people who are antagonistic to those spaces?
Okay. Um, in interacting with the like youth themselves, one common trend that like makes me sad is the like excitement they get over an adult like asking them about their identity and their pronouns. Um, like it's not a thing they commonly experience of like an adult figure coming into their lives and being like, yo, who are you, so that I can make sure like respecting that. um and it's just it's not a common thing for many of them. And then also, um like there's just a lot of adults who um often like belittle the experiences of these youth just because they're youth. Like it's tied to a lot of ageism.
Right.
um like just because they're like teenagers, there's this assumption that they don't have the ability to know who they are authentically, as if they aren't experiencing their own lives on a daily basis, which is pretty ridiculous. That's a thing. Um, and so like that comes with a lot of like institutional barriers, um, of like, yeah, in theory we want to respect like trans and gender nonconforming students and LGBT students, but in practice we're not going to go further than like just giving more information to allies. It's like, um, because this is a conversation that's considered to be like pretty edgy. Um, one of the so my main issue work is trying to get at the school district level a like policy or something that would make it so that all the teachers in the school district would get training on like gender identity and pronouns. And so far the conversations we've been having, people are like, people who work in relation to like teachers and the school district keep telling us like that's going to be a hard thing to do, to because it took them about 7 years or so of like pushing for trainings with the Human Rights Campaign, for optional trainings, to come into the school district. So it's like if it took so long to just get some resources out here for people who already like are respecting people's just like identities, the the chances of moving something larger than that, where like you're really pushing against people's like personal bigotries, gets even more complicated.
Right. And I feel like this is definitely where just personal responsibility for people who claim that kind of solidarity need to really step up and like not just put their money where their mouth is, but genuinely take those steps to having a proactive culture that actually
Yeah.
deals with heteronormativity, that deals with cisnormativity, and knowing that you should ask what someone's identity is, and you should
Yeah.
respect it once you understand what it is.
Yeah, right. So it's like going from being an ally to actually being an accomplice, which is like putting these things into action instead of just like in theory being like, I support LGBTQ rights.
Right.
Like, which is one of the things we get a lot. Like, it's a very passive type of support.
Would you say, because this obviously being that we live in the U.S. empire like that, would you say that race definitely plays a factor in how those conversations are discussed?
Um, yes. I think one of the like interesting things that I've noticed in my work is that the bulk of the like gender nonconforming students I've been meeting have been white. Um, so like right, like it's definitely a racialized thing in terms of like there are so many more barriers for people of color to come into this type of analysis of themselves and like understanding of their own gender identity, because not only is your gender like a thing that where when you're growing up within a like white supremacist country, there's this right, like so many of us who are people of color like get uglified, which means that like we are constantly reminded that we don't fit into these two boxes. And so at the end of the day, you end up having to like hyper perform to try and get like be taken seriously within those boxes.
Right.
And like when you are white and there's not that a level of race attached to your identity in that way, I definitely do think it's easier to disconnect from it.
Right. Because even though it's a non-binary, a kind of an identity that exists in a trans space, it's still a white identity. So regardless of how that gender presents itself, there is kind of a safety
like
in that gender expression.
a lot of the like gender nonconforming content that like teenagers get exposed to online is definitely very white centered. And the like just the way that like media outlets report on like transness and like gender nonconformity, it's like you constantly see these white people be the models for it. Like you see like Sam Smith a lot on these articles about like using they them pronouns and stuff. When it's like it is just so dumb, because the gender binary as it exists in our society is a thing that stems from white supremacy and like colonization. To answer your question, yes, there is definitely a racial aspect to it.
Yeah. No, and also just even beyond just how we have to hyper-perform, just the idea that non-white gender expression is something that relates to that capitalist system, and so it becomes a lot more consumable to have not just an alternative idea of gender or sex like that, but then to have it in that capitalist system where you're still a black person or a brown person or an indigenous person. And so there's a lot more insecurity and danger in having those kind of identities.
Yeah.
We'll come back to gender, but I also wanted to ask you about just organizing generally, because you don't just do organizing with high schoolers with the LGBT plus community, but you also do work as far as the Amazon protest that went on and other things like that, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. Wherever there are spaces where we are challenging some like societal norm, right? I think is a good space to work in. Right, when it comes to the Amazon protests, like what we are directly challenging capitalism. And a lot of like it's like a lot of people who are on the grounds like might not necessarily have the full extent of the analysis that's what they're doing, but it's like it's because this area is so like governed by warehouses and big industry, and you constantly have people who like get channeled into these warehouses. Right? You go to school, you get a shitty education, you go home where you're constantly being like policed and criminalized, like just by existing. And like you can't like, and then like everywhere in an empire, like when you are a poor person of color, you are being fed this narrative that like all you're good for is like menial physical labor.
Exactly.
And so you get channeled back into these warehouses with the like, but like they what's the word I'm looking for? Like they tell you, these big companies are doing you a favor because they're bringing jobs for you. So even though you're doing this like backbreaking physical labor, even though you're getting this like shitty wage, even though you're just this cog in this money-making machine for Jeff Bezos, like you should be grateful because they're jobs. Even though like you are actively being forced to participate in something that is deteriorating your health and like the local environments of your community. Be grateful.
And also just like the idea that they're creating jobs, you know, I'm going to pay you a subsistence wage for you to provide labor versus not having any wages.
Yeah.
And just like the idea that like Jeff Bezos, the guy who owns Amazon, like he could easily pay all of his employees a living wage across all the states.
Yeah,
and he would still have billions of dollars.
He would still have a shit ton of money, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I got tied into this work. Well, one, because I'm an anti-capitalist, but but two, also because I end up doing a lot of environmental work, because I've met a decent amount of like environmentalists or like folks who have a good environmental analysis that is anti-capitalist, because you cannot like it turns into eco-fascism if you don't have an anti-capitalist analysis, right?
Exactly.
Because then you're pointing fingers at the individual and like talking about like overpopulation when that's not the problem. The problem is these big corporations keep fucking up the earth because they're just trying to make money and all they care about is profit.
Exactly.
And like yeah, and so I just kind of so I have a background in youth organizing, but I also accidentally fell into environmental organizing for a good while because of it.
Very nice.
Yeah, so youth organizing, environmental organizing, and LGBTQ organizing tend to be my three main spaces.
You mentioned environmental organizing. Were there any particular issues that were kind of your focus as far as the environment?
This whole Amazon thing, there's environmental organizations at the center of it, pushing the analysis of like how all of the industry and the expansion of industry in the area is creating high amounts of air pollution. And like that's just the reality for people in the area. I've also, because I am directly passionate about youth organizing, have organized youth trainings under the Sierra Club. Well, I mean, it is under the Sierra Club, but it's under their youth chapter, which is called the Sierra Student Coalition. They do these trainings, these summer trainings in 4 different regions. They do one in the West, they do one in the South, they do one in the Midwest, and they do one in Puerto Rico. and you get about 30 youth, 30 to 40 youth in one space for a week. And like you teach them a curriculum, which ends up being like anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and like give these youth who go back home into their own organizing communities with a well-rounded analysis of like these systems of oppression are all connected, and we're talking about them in this environmental space, because if we don't bring in this full analysis, the environmental work you do isn't like what it should be. Like you just end up recreating the faults of capitalism otherwise. And so that's how I fell into environmental organizing, where it's like folks who on the surface do environmental stuff, but like underneath the surface are actually like trying to move in a like revolutionary direction. And it's an interesting overlap that doesn't exist in many environmental spaces,
No, that's
but
really
but exists within like young folks of color who do environmental work.
to what you were saying, just how to look at ecology or environmental issues and activism as just all of the negative effects that capitalism wreaks on certain communities, and how you can really articulate that in that type of environmental racism, that you can't just like wash away with green capitalism or just any analysis that, or any type of solution that isn't based on addressing imperialism and addressing racism and the systemic oppression.
Yeah.
But I guess to that point about environmental racism and just generally how we look at the environment, what do you think are some really valuable tools that people of color generally have done as a community that has been really effective?
OMG. Okay, anyways, hi. I still can't hear you. Dear Lord. How do we build revolutionary communities despite all the bullshit?
What I mean to say is these communities that are affected by environmental racism, how they build really important community infrastructure and institutions, like how, like, if you go to black communities, like, love them or hate them, the black church does serve a function in actually helping black people, like, actually organize different community events. It's how different people know each other in different ways, and that there are spaces that we create that have been made very, very literally through utility to survive what white supremacy.
Yeah, okay, got it. Church is a big thing. It really is. Which, like, as a queer person, it's hard to, like, have... It's like... okay. Yeah, churches are a funky place. Because, like, on one hand, are always, like, are definitely a product of, like, colonialism. Like, in areas like this. Right, where it's, like, Catholic churches in Southern California were definitely at the forefront of colonizing indigenous people. But, like, despite all of that like history now stand as a place where a lot of like Latinx families do find a um like safe space to exist in that is beyond capitalism. Like that doesn't like right because it's like everywhere you go in your community, like public spaces don't really exist for folks. Like and so churches are a good place to organize in. And there's a lot of organizing that happens within the Catholic churches when it comes to like immigrant rights, um, and support and stuff. So I do want to echo that like churches is a big thing, um, but also like one of the places that is like overlooked a lot is the on-campus like clubs that students create with each other. Like that is also like as long as you have an advisor and a charter for your club, like it is a space you can exist in for a while and like talk about organizing and like political issues and stuff, but that a lot of people don't realize that that is a tool, and is one of our tools that we use in our youth organizing because so many students like can't go to meetings off of their campuses, but it's so easy to be like, yo, let's just meet right after class for like an hour and a half and we'll bring you pizza. um, and historically in the like youth organizing I've done, it has been useful as a tool to keep students engaged when they're like don't really have the capacity to like be going to a bunch of other places, um, and then also just like right the like deeper you get into organizing communities, the more of a like widespread network. Yeah, can you hear me?
But we're just gonna keep talking
Okay.
because it OBS is weird. But no, just that's really important. Just understanding how like there are so many different institutions that already exist that can be used and taken advantage of to organize
Yeah,
for just people and their needs. Like we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
like the institutions exist. The people are within them. I think we're in a place where, and like this is a thing I've just been like thinking about a lot lately, right? Where it's like because we exist in the heart of like this imperialist beast, um, it's hard not. Like it's impossible to exist outside of it. Um, And so while the institutions exist, right, while capitalism exists, you have to you have to exist in this like place of a like oxymoron where you are channeling resources from these systems because you there's no way for you to exist outside of the systems and you need like the money, you need the spaces, um, in order to do the work. Um, and like just like walking the fine line of like, okay, let's engage with these institutions, let's engage with like this money, but with an understanding of where it stems from and what you're trying to gain out of it and like the restrictions of the containers you're in.
Right. And knowing that, like, and again, this is just me being the fucking communist, that there is this very real idea that there are people in communities who have money there are guilty parties in communities who have money, and that getting that money from those people is definitely a part of that process too. Just knowing that, like, you can know a person who's from that upper middle class background, who knows a lot of white people whose sympathies are there, who have money, who can put it into like an organization to help the LGBTQA plus people, to help indigenous struggles, to help because they have money.
Just like massage that white guilt a little bit, you know?
Yeah, no, for real.
But yeah, definitely.
So just to kind of bring it back to the queer community and just how important all this information is, what are some very important lessons that either you've done through your research or just your own life you would say all queer persons, especially if they're doing this kind of work, should always consider?
The non-profit industrial complex, while a tool, is not the way to liberation. Is one of the things that like I've really been sitting on lately. Especially, so we're building, this work is weird because I'm wearing two hats. One of them is under ICUC, Inland Congregations United for Change, is who I've like organized with for years of my life. But they're giving us the like financial sponsorship. Is that what it's? Yeah, they're a financial sponsor in order to build the foundation for this nonprofit we're building called Inland Empire Prism Collective, which is going to be all centered on like LGBTQ youth advocacy and needs and like resources. And so we're like building the foundation for that. And we need a board of people to like help us make the like financial decisions. And in like trying to create that, those of us who are on board and have been on board and like doing the work and like thinking about who else are we bringing onto the table, one of the things that we discussed was that one, we want a board that's like all QT-POC of like QT-POC who are living in the Inland Empire, who are under the age of 30, so like have a clear understanding of what it's like to be a young person and a youth. But also, like we discussed, that the furthest the right will go in terms of like people's personal politics is like nothing less than a democratic socialist. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a queer person of color. Like, if your like personal values aren't like lining up to socialism or like leftism in general, like we don't really want you to be making these financial decisions for the organization. Because again, goes back to that like oxymoron of like the nonprofit industrial complex recreates the faults of capitalism. But I think when you have the correct people with a good analysis, you can find the loopholes in that.
Right.
And like use like while we exist in the like American imperialism, can still figure out a way to navigate this tool in a way that like is creating the groundwork for liberation and like revolution.
Absolutely.
And yeah, being a queer person, like navigating organizing spaces is not enough, because a lot of times like you just have queer people who end up like recreating, like, right, where it's like people say they want liberation, but really what they want is privilege. And so like end up recreating like the oppression we like deal with on a daily basis once they gain access to resources.
to kind of further extend on that point, just how there really is this push, and I think it really is the byproduct of the civil rights movement with the queer movement, and just this idea of becoming bourgeois is good enough, and just this middle class idea of queerness where we can marry like straight people, we can have kids like straight people, we can reproduce capitalism like straight people, and in this very Barbie and Ken doll kind of way, be queer, however that is, in this very white way too.
Yeah, it's just like we can also participate in cisheteropatriarchy, but just queer. You know, like, no, that's not what I'm about, and I don't think that's not what queer liberation is about. And like, while I do think that there are certain things to focus on for like harm reduction, the goal of like the long-term goal of queer liberation is always tied to anti-capitalist liberation, and I don't see that happening any other way.
If you can't deal with the economic, then like our core identity is just a consumptive product. And that's it. I guess one thing I would want to just kind of mention before like we get to like the ending is just how like, because I think it's important in all like spaces involving sex or anything like that, but just how like really important like discussions about consent and deep conversations about like what does it mean to be self-aware in that way, and to actually take that kind of responsibility and really have that driven home in queer spaces.
Those are some of the conversations we've started to have with like the youth who, like, I don't know, like it's this fine line, because a lot of queer spaces are very hypersexual, and I understand why. Like, I understand that when you live in a society that shames you for like your sexual wants, the response is to flaunt as like a defense mechanism. But also, like, I think, like, especially in, like, we've gone so beyond that at this point in history, where, like, that shouldn't be a need anymore. And, like, having conversations around, like, okay, how can we exist as a queer community in like all our complexities, including like people who are asexual who are also queer and like policed a lot within the queer community, like who are just not all the time vibing with like that sexual energy, but have a right to exist in these spaces, and like that's where those conversations around consent become so crucial. And like, okay, then that means we need to be creating spaces where we can talk about sex in a way that is respectful of people's boundaries. You just need to like create structures around like when is it right to be bringing in those conversations and when is it not, and like still realizing this is learning that should happen, but it needs to happen within a container that can hold it. Over the summer, I went and I was a counselor at a queer camp in Vermont, because one of my friends like helps run it, and so I went and did that for a week, and it was amazing to me how like they had a whole sex workshop for the youth, and like they were giving them like pamphlets and stuff, and like on the pamphlets was like how to like fist, like how to do fisting in a way that's like safe. And so I'm like, it's possible to give that content in a way that's educational and
We're
brings
queer.
in
Here's explicit sex.
yeah, and brings in the conversation of consent to it, without it being like having to like be this is taboo, because it's not. Those are the real experiences that queer people have. Like we navigate sex in a way that's not cis heteronormative, and like people need to have access to that education in order to do it in a safe way, and like have access to like should have access to like talking about their own experiences, but also realizing that there's just a time and place for it.
Right. And just like how it is important because like there is a lot of trauma. It's important to have that empathy and that ahead of just like asking questions of people feel comfortable having these conversations, and what is the relationship to sex, and how learning that at a young age, and like you said, the youth, like that can save like lifetimes of hurt and trauma that has to be learned the hard way.
Yeah, like how do we create a culture where youth feel safe asking these questions and don't end up in weird situations where they're also recreating traumas for people because they weren't given the correct education on it. Yeah, like no, like we're all just having these very individual experiences around sex in many different ways.
It was a really good conversation. I'm really glad we got to have this conversation.
Yeah, me
I know
too.
you do a lot of know you do a lot of work, and so I know you have like a lot of wisdom that comes from just a lot of experience.
Wisdom.
No, for real. You do the work, you get that experience. But no, where can people find you out if they want to learn more about organizing, or just like different directions you can point people at?
We have an Instagram account called IE Prism Collective. Prism. People always hear prison, like jail, but it's not. It's not. It's prism, like the clear thing that makes rainbows. So IE Prism Collective is our Instagram, and it would be cool if people followed us there.
But no, yeah. Thanks for having this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. This was a good chat.
Courage the cowardly dog. Courage the cowardly dog.
What if the biggest superstar in the world was your music teacher?
It would be amazing. It could be a disaster. Everything would be magical.
Or everything could burn down.